Hey, Larkin Rose here, and this is the third in my series called Slave Think, based on the works of Frederick Douglass, who grew up as a slave and wrote about his experiences and wrote about his basically slow revelation that slavery is not okay. Again, this is something that a lot of us have a hard time relating to anybody having trouble imagining that, because we're all surrounded by people who say, yeah, of course slavery is bad. Well, if you were surrounded by people who all said, well, yeah, you're the property of that guy, you can imagine that you would say, no, I'm not. But you probably wouldn't think that. Most of them didn't they didn't like it. They suffered and they complained about their situation, but most of them thought that slavery and them being owned was somehow legitimate, and it was legal, and it was even proper. And it's something that's hard for us to imagine, but when it comes to the stupid things that people believe today, the stupid, evil, oppressive things people believe today, we're suddenly blind to it, we in the generic sense. Now, I have to say this again because people will complain if I don't. I'm not at all comparing the severity and nastiness of what Americans go through right now to what actual chattel slaves went through. I'm not saying the degree of severity is the same. I am pointing out similarities in the principles involved, and specifically in the psychology involved, both of the robbers and their victims. And this is one that I've mentioned before that very obviously relates to the psychology and the principles involved in taxation, and specifically the income tax. So here's a quote I often mention. I've seen others mention it. It's sort of the general principle first, but then I'll read what comes next. So these are the words of Frederick Douglass. I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. Okay, so that's a general principle, pretty creepy lesson he's giving us. But here's the part that comes next, right after that. Again, this is the first-hand account of somebody who grew up a slave. I was now getting, as I have said, $1.50 per day. I contracted for it. I earned it. It was paid to me. It was rightfully my own. Yet, upon each returning Saturday night, I was compelled to deliver every cent of that money to Master Hugh, one of many masters he had over his lifetime. And why? Not because he earned it, not because he had any hand in earning it, not because I owed it to him, nor because he possessed the slightest shadow of a right to it, but solely because he had the power to compel me to give it up. The right of the grim-visaged pirate upon the high seas is exactly the same. End quote. So this is him coming to the realization, this is just robbery. Of course, duh, taking the fruits of somebody's labor without their consent is robbery. But check this out. Now, this is an account under a different master, but he's talking about the same thing. I was to be allowed all my time, make all contracts with those for whom I worked, and find my own employment. And in return for this liberty, I was to pay him $3 at the end of each week. Rain or shine, work or no work, at the end of each week, the money must be forthcoming, or I must give up my privilege. You're allowed to work, Mr. Slave, but you must pay your master the cut that he demands, or you're not allowed to work anymore. This arrangement, again back to Frederick Douglass's words, this arrangement, it will be perceived, was decidedly in my master's favor. It relieved him of all need of looking after me. His money was sure. He received all the benefits of slaveholding without its evils, while I endured all the evils of a slave and suffered all the care and anxiety of a free man. So this is somebody who was a slave coming to realize that the equivalent of an income tax was in a way worse than slavery, because he was basically robbing himself. He wasn't even like being whipped. He was being made to do, he had to go find the work. He had to go contract for it. He had to go do all the work and then pay tribute to the master. Okay, another thing relevant to this. This is under another other master. In the early, words of Frederick Douglass here, in the early part of the year 1838, I became quite restless. I could see no reason why I should, at the end of each week, pour the reward of my toil into the purse of my master. When I carried to him my weekly wages, he would, after counting the money, look me in the face with a robber-like fierceness and ask, "Is this all?" IRS audit, anyone? You're not hiding anything from us. You're telling us all the income you have so we can decide how much of it we can take and how much we will let you keep. He was satisfied, back to the words of Frederick Douglass, he, meaning the master, was satisfied with nothing less than the last cent. He would, however, when I made him $6, sometimes give me 6 cents to encourage me. Oh, so he decides how much to take and how much to let you keep. He's so noble. And he did this to encourage Frederick Douglass. Quote, it had the opposite effect. I regarded it as a sort of admission of my right to the whole. The fact that he gave me any part of my wages was proof, to my mind, that he believed me entitled to the whole of them. I always felt worse for having received anything, for I feared that the giving me a few cents would ease his conscience and make him feel himself to be a pretty honorable sort of robber. So, and again, I'm giving you bits and pieces. I encourage people to read more of what Frederick Douglass wrote. But this, I almost fell out of my chair. Incidentally, the first time I read this, I was in prison for not paying tribute to the federal government, for not filing tax returns. It was a misdemeanor. It wasn't even tax evasion. But yeah, I was in there in a cage for having not given to the master what he demanded of me. And the fact that in that case I didn't even break the law, that's another story. Never mind that. But just about fell out of my chair, basically reading a slave saying, this thing, which is the equivalent of an income tax, is somehow worse than slavery because the person who decides how much they're going to steal can sort of pretend that they're doing me a favor by not stealing at all. Like the carjacker let me keep my wallet so he could feel better about himself. So it's kind of amazing to have, the taxation is theft and taxation is extortion. It's a little more precise. A lot of people get huffy even at that, even though it's obviously theft. And when people say taxation is slavery, then people get really huffy because they think slavery has to mean you're being like violently, openly whipped and stuff for not producing. But to take the fruits of somebody's labor without their consent, that by definition, that's slavery. You're forcing somebody to work for somebody else and like without their consent, without paying them anything. And the realization by Frederick Douglass that the equivalent of an income tax was more of an affront. It was like more of an insult to let me have a little bit because you know damn well it's all mine. Mr. Politician, Mr. IRS agent, Mr. Parasitic bureaucrat piece of crap. And so for an actual slave who's slowly going through this process where, well, I'm still the property of the master, but he lets me go and find work and have all the trouble and all the hardship of a free person trying to find employment. And then he robs me without him having to do anything. He didn't have to, follow me around with a whip. He didn't have to do it. I just robbed myself and gave it to him. And that's the best of all worlds for the master. Gee whiz. So, later on, thankfully, Frederick Douglass not only freed his mind, he freed his body. He got up north and he got a job. And I had to read this part because it relates, obviously, to this whole topic here. Quote, "I was now my own master. It was a happy moment, the rapture of which can be understood only by those who have been slaves. It was the first work, the reward of which was to be entirely my own. There was no Master Hugh standing ready the moment I earned the money to rob me of it. I worked that day with a pleasure I had never before experienced." When we talk about principles and we talk about philosophy and we talk about psychology, it's so easy for people to say, well, right now I'm kind of comfortable and right now we have luxuries that nobody had, like the slaveholders didn't even have back then. We're so dang spoiled that how can you possibly compare like this to slavery? Because in principle, it's the same thing. In the real world, practical daily life, yeah, we have it a trillion times easier than, slaves picking cotton in the fields had it, obviously. But the principle is the same. And the thing is, if you're a slave master who wants subservient and productive slaves, you actually don't want them suffering horribly, because then they have a reason to revolt or run away or kill you or something. You want them to be prosperous enough that you can easily steal a whole bunch from them and they have no thought of resisting. They have no thought of running away because they have something to lose. Now, Frederick Douglass goes to great lengths to describe how the desire to escape and be free slowly grew in his mind, and he talked to others and planned, like, how are we going to get away? And that the ways he attempted it, and a bunch of them didn't work. And all of that mental escape is because he had nothing to lose other than his life. And at some point he even said, even if they're going to kill me, like, I won't consider myself a man if I don't at some point try to be free. Because you could see his brain was getting free of the BS that he was taught, to the point where it's like, now I have to try to get my body free of this because this is insane. And, there are lines in the Jones Plantation that are about exactly this. But to see the principle involved and realize it isn't less evil just because the master lets you be more comfortable. If a master figures out, if we let them have a nice house and a nice car and steal this much from them, instead of stealing so much that they're impoverished and then they're not really productive and they're bitter and they're angry, and like, the goal of the slave master is not, unless he's just an idiot psycho, is not the suffering of the slaves. It's to steal as much productivity from the slaves as they possibly can. Well, the modern ruling class does a way better job of stealing way more productivity from decent, hardworking people than the old slave masters ever did. Because the brute force way of doing it, they have nothing to lose. They're not all that productive. It's just kind of manual labor. They don't know how to do anything beyond that. Whereas a form of slavery where you can get way more out of the people and have them be way more comfortable so they have something to lose, something they're scared of losing. So that when they get audited by the IRS, he looks at them suspiciously and said, "Did you report it all?" Exactly like he just described. "Yes, sir, I reported all. Here's it. Here's all my documents." And yes, sir, every year I will go out of my way to rob myself. You don't even have to do it. I'll fill out all the forms to rob myself and confess everything to you. And you just give me a form that lets me do the math too to figure out how much of what I earn you're going to steal and how much you're going to let me keep. And that's the thing that a lot of people, things are very different depending on how you look at them. Everybody knows, oh yeah, Congress determines the tax rates. They determine how much they're going to take from your paycheck or from your business or from whatever. Well, the other way to say that is they decide how much of what you produce that they will let you keep. That makes you their slave because they get to decide how much that is. If they decide they take 80%, they take 80%, and you're a criminal if you resist. And you're supposed to be grateful that they're not taking it all. And when they talk about tax cuts, we're going to let you keep a little bit more. We're still going to rob you. We're still going to do nasty things to you if we catch you trying to hide anything that you earned. If we catch you not paying a cut to us when you're voluntarily trading with your fellow man, we will do nasty things. But don't worry, you should praise us. You should praise us Republicans for the tax cut, for us letting you keep a little bit more, or at least pretending we're going to let you keep a little bit more of what you earn. Aren't we generous? No, you're a bunch of damn thieves. Exactly like the Democrats. And for Frederick Douglass to notice and get pissed off at the fact that the master expects me to think he's a nice guy because he's letting me keep a little bit of what I produced, what I earned, while stealing as much as he wants. Now, the stupid slave master back then, the old school, was stealing 99% of it. Because he talks about when I earned $6, he might give me 6 cents. Well, that's kind of a stupid way to do it because you're not going to get as much productivity out of it. And the modern day thieves and robbers and extortionists and parasites and slave masters get way more productivity out of their human livestock than old school. And by the way, that's kind of, even from the earliest scenes of the Jones plantation, that's kind of the theme. Mr. Jones's plantation isn't doing well because he's doing it old school by just open brute force instead of by manipulation and deception and fear-mongering that Mr. Smith teaches them how to do that to get more out of his slaves. And that's exactly what government is. It's a bunch of evil, parasitic thieves and would-be slave masters who just found a way more effective way to enslave people. And I hope that the movie is going to slap a bunch of people upside the head with that reality and make them realize, wow, this isn't morally better. The fact that we're way more comfortable than, a slave being whipped while he works 16 hours and picking cotton all day. The fact that we're more comfortable doesn't make the theft okay. It doesn't make extortion and terrorism okay. It just means the people robbing us are a little more intelligent and creative in their means of stealing the lifeblood of their victims. And that's all it means. And I think that's going to be one of the main things that people take away from watching the Jones plantation is realizing, oh, holy smokes, we're a lot more comfortable. Life is a lot easier. But wow, it's the same damn game all over the world. Every government everywhere is playing the games that Mr. Smith knows how to play. And the old school slave masters like Mr. Jones, they didn't understand it, so they weren't getting that much out of their human livestock. And only with the help of the Mr. Smiths of the world did they realize, oh, there's a way better way to rob huge numbers of people and have them put up with it and have them have something to lose so that they're way too scared to actually disobey or resist. And so, yeah, I hope that's a kick in the teeth to a whole lot of people when they realize, holy smokes, not only is that the reality, but most of them cheer for it and believe in it and vote for it and empower it. They are accomplices to their own enslavement. And I hope the movie helps people realize that. So once again, we're having online watch party on August 5th. And after that, the movie will be for sale. So if you go to jonesplantationfilm.com, you can see all of that, whether it's for the watch party or for the movie after the fact. That's where updates and things will be going on. And just, it's the sort of thing that most of the world isn't going to sit down and read a whole bunch of Frederick Douglass. Like, they're only going to get these ideas if somebody puts it in the form that they're used to, like watching a movie. Like, the likelihood of the general public sitting down and reading Frederick Douglass's biography is essentially zero. They don't have the attention span. Ironically, they probably couldn't understand half of the vocabulary that a slave used like almost 200 years ago, because his education, even starting as a slave who wasn't allowed to read, maybe I'll get into reading some of that in other parts, his mental acuity and awareness and intelligence and eloquence and his vocabulary, sadly, is way beyond the vast majority of spoiled, rich, supposedly educated Americans. Why is that? I think in the next episode of Slave Think, we're going to get into why that is, because Frederick Douglass talked about that too, and his challenge in learning how to read and learning how to think, and his revelations about that. But that's probably enough for this particular rant. Again, jonesplantationfilm.com if you want to be in on the watch party, or if you want to buy the movie for like $9.99 after the fact. But yeah, thus concludes part 3, but there will be part 4 and probably a part 5. And again, I encourage people to read everything Frederick Douglass wrote. Prepare to be sickened by a bunch of it, because it's horrible and evil. But if we can't learn from the horrible and evil, then it was horrible and evil for nothing. And the fact that Frederick Douglass would share his experiences, it's like he had to go through that, just like other people suffered under all sorts of tyrannies, and described, like Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, describing all that. If we don't learn from the evils of the past, we do it all over again, over and over and over again. And the slavesmiths of the world get better and better at playing the game. If we don't understand it, we're going to keep falling for it. And so I'm so thankful that people who had to go through hell like Frederick Douglass didn't just say, well, I got free, screw the world. He said, I want to share this. I want people to understand this. It's important that humanity grasps this and stops behaving this way. And for those who have gone through real suffering, way beyond what I've gone through and most of you have gone through. Like, yeah, I constantly complain about statism, fully aware that there are millions and millions and millions and millions of people who had it way worse than I did. But if in principle we don't oppose the foundational ideas that allowed for all of that evil to happen, it's going to happen again. And so for my relatively cushy life, despite being broke and stressed out about various things, my concerns are zero compared to those of like a plantation slave, and I'm fully aware of that. And my suffering is zero compared to them. Even when I was in prison, my life was easier than that of a slave. But I'm also aware of the fact that if we don't understand and deal with the underlying principles, it's going to happen again. And we're going to keep doing the cycle. We, humanity, is going to keep doing the cycle until the people in general understand this to a point where they stop playing the game and they stop empowering and enriching all the slavesmiths of the world. So yeehaw. Check out the Jones Meditation and check out the next video I make about slave think.